glad to have. And that's for all of our friends on Zoom. I'm Mayo Taylor. I'm the president of the Blue Ridge Naturalist Network. I'm finishing up my first year at it. Things have been going all right, but this is our last event for 2023. We are going into a little bear-like hibernation for a few months, although we'll roust out the board members early and start getting things planned and getting word out to you. So I don't have a lot for announcements. I always like to start by thanking Ollie and thanking the Reuter Center and UNCA for making this fabulous facility available to us. And we're always particularly appreciative of our the tech students. We have Janaki upstairs who is watching over us. There she is, and making sure we've got the Zoom right and all is good. Many of you are members. If you're not a member and you're not getting our emails yet, we have a sign-up sheet here where you will start getting our newsletters. And then if you decide you don't want to get our newsletters anymore, you just unsubscribe. It's not a lifetime habit that you have to develop. And we never come and knock on your door. So it'll be all right. We do have some new members coming on our board. We'll start meeting again in January, and we are looking for program ideas. Fortunately, we're well covered on the outdoor programs because we've got Paul Fredrickson taking over from Randy Richardson as our outdoor leader. And Randy's gonna stick around and help too. But we are always in need of ideas for this kind of program. So if you get a wild idea in the middle of the night about what you just would love to have us do a program on, just send an email off to president@brnnetwork.org. So Blue Ridge Naturalist Network.org. And hopefully we'll have a pretty good calendar put together for you. All right. I'm going to introduce our speaker who's got a program for us. And then at the end, there'll be questions, or there could be questions during it. Because we do have people on Zoom, the questions need to be done into a microphone, which is kind of a pain to get it around everybody. But otherwise, the people who are doing it online have no idea what the question was, and they may not be able to tell from the answer. So a little patience with that process is good. So Justin McVey is our District 9 mountain area regional wildlife biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology and a Master of Science degree in wildlife and conservation biology from North Carolina State University. What got him here tonight is his graduate work was on the food habits of coyotes and red wolves in eastern North Carolina, which of course is where the red wolves are. And so who better to tell us about what we know is a growing population of coyotes in our mountains. He's been with the Resources Commission since 2005. He's a megafauna specialist, and he's held the position of captive cervid biologist, wildlife technician, permits biologist, and then now our district wildlife biologist. So turn it over to Justin.
So I didn't know that I was a megafauna specialist. It's not because of my size, but it is fitting. So thank you for the introduction. So I'm your district biologist. I cover the western 12 counties. My role for the Wildlife Commission is I get to do a lot of different things. So I provide technical guidance to folks. People that want wildlife on their property can contact me, and I can advise them on things to cut, things to plant, how to make your property more attractive. In Asheville, I spend a lot of time with people that don't want wildlife on their property, namely bears. So I do a lot of bear work. I monitor the district for different wildlife diseases, work with hunting regulations and those populations. And I also get to be the elk biologist, which is a lot of fun. So I get to do some research stuff. So if you have elk questions, I'm the guy apparently. So, but today, asked to talk about coyotes. As you guys know, they're ubiquitous on the landscape and everywhere. So we'll just go ahead and dive right in. Maybe not. Can I just do this? All right. Thanks. Good thing she was here. We would have just watched this one slide the whole time. So today we're going to talk about where coyotes came from, what they're like in North Carolina, what effect do they have, and what can we do about them, if anything, or if it's actually needed. So first, let's look at the coyote distribution. Really, coyotes were originally from the Midwest. You can see before the 1700s are in that darker center area. Then early 1900s, they started to expand out just through natural migration. As railroads and highways were built across the country, coyotes naturally just started following those corridors. And then today you can see everybody gets coyotes. So the whole United States. For North Carolina in particular, so prior to 1983, we really just had a few hot spots throughout. 1938 was the first reported incident in Gaston County, and you can see there 47 in Swain County, so still in our neck of the woods, 55 in Johnston County, and that was the first one that was actually documented. The other ones were just sightings, but that was actually documented. And it continued on and kind of spotty. So why are these locations, can you see those red dots in there? No. So why are these locations just kind of sporadic throughout North Carolina? Well, apparently some folks went down to Texas. There was hunting of coyotes with dogs, and they thought, gee golly, this is a lot of fun. And so they thought they would bring some coyotes back up here to run their dogs on. So they had these spots where they were trying to do that. So the mid 80s, you can see 1980s, you can see the distribution of that hatched area of kind of the southeast. And then we can look at North Carolina and we see more and more counties starting to become populated. Now, not all these counties were hunting at this point. Some stuff started breeding naturally and started occurring naturally. Between 88 and 1990, you can see kind of a natural migration from the west. And again, this was just following, I-40 and other interstates and highways. 96 even more. And at this point, those two kind of, almost like opposite ends of the state, we had coyotes and they kind of started to join together. So at this point, we've got a commingling population. Just increases. And now we're all shaded in. You can see the barrier islands there aren't shaded, but guess what? They've got coyotes too now. So everybody gets a coyote. So basically all 100 counties have, by 2009, have had coyotes. Next, let's just talk a little bit about what a coyote is, a coyote description. So typically around 25 to 40 pounds. Most of the time when people call me about a coyote, they see this 90-pound thing. They swear it's 100 pounds. It might be a wolf, and, after talking to them, figure out it's just a coyote. They do come in a variety of coat colors, from kind of the typical there on your left, that red color, all the way to a black color. It has been found that black color in coyotes is actually from a domestic dog gene. So there is some interbreeding with domestic dogs, much like with red wolves that was mentioned earlier. Coyotes and red wolves can interbreed. It's really kind of a canid genetic soup there. So what is coyote habitat? Well, just like North Carolina, it's really varied. It's basically everywhere. So from urban areas, cities, golf courses, your backyard, agriculture, they're pretty much everywhere. You folks have probably heard about Chicago. They're pretty well-known coyote population in Chicago, and they're right there in the city. They're amazing animals and really smart. It's actually been seen, well, they'll stop and watch for the crosswalks so they won't get hit by cars. So, and that's not a joke. It's funny, but it's not a joke. So coyotes are just super, super adaptable. And that's kind of the thing to think about when you think about coyotes, whether it's their food or their habitat or where they're living, they can just adapt. So this is actually in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is a collared female. And you can see she, had no problem, being in Raleigh. However, she's pretty smart, stuck to these kind of wooded areas. And that was, she would travel across the roads and those types of things, but she knew where the safe spots were, where to kind of hide out. Now, coyote food. So I've already heard some folks talking about cats, and I'll address that in a minute. Basically, they'll eat anything. They're a generalist species. They're just kind of whatever's around, they're going to eat. Whether that's, livestock, grasshoppers, persimmons, in Chicago, specifically, they do eat quite a few feral cats that's been found. But Chicago also has a lot of feral cats. So this is some diet estimates of coyotes, some groundbreaking research from a really tall, handsome biologist. At least the one on the left was. So my research focused on red wolves and coyotes on the Albemarle Peninsula where they overlapped. I found coyotes mainly ate small rodents, cotton rats, things like that, followed by rabbits and then white-tailed deer. My colleague who did a study at Fort Bragg, probably the year or two after I left grad school, she found something different. She found that it was soft-masked insects and then white-tailed deer. There's a couple of reasons for that disparity. One, it does show you that coyotes are just adaptable and they're going to eat whatever is around. It also goes to some of the techniques that we used. So in my study, I took DNA samples of every single scat. Scat is just what we call poop. We use the name scat, makes us feel smarter, feel better about ourselves. We can talk to our mom and dad without being ashamed. So I went and took DNA samples from all these scats. And what that did was that kicked out a lot of scat samples that may have been loaded down with things like persimmons and grasshoppers. My colleague at Fort Bragg didn't do any DNA work. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the stuff that was found was not even coyote. It was stuff that was smaller, like foxes and things like that. So it's hard to pick a perfect study. But overall, the important thing is you can see they just eat a ton of stuff. It was a feral cat colony in my study area. I did get samples from red wolves and from coyotes near that feral cat colony. I had the distinct pleasure of digging through 1,000 pieces of scat, looking and figuring out what was what. Never found little Fluffy in there, not one cat. Never found a Fido. No, that just wasn't part of the diet, especially out there. Probably the most interesting thing I found was a snapping turtle foot. So another reason that, besides just being, yes, sir. Well, can we hold the questions to the end so we can do all the microphone stuff? Because it's going to be cumbersome to try to do it now. So coyotes are really great at, have been so successful, one, because of that habitat, that diet preference and being so varied. Another reason is just their dispersal. So this was a collared female that was collared at Fort Bragg. You can see she moved all the way to the western part of Georgia and then ended up settling a little towards the center part. So that's about 188 miles. And that's not uncommon. The one that we saw in Raleigh earlier, that was from the coast. So they can travel a great distance. And that's one of the reasons that they are so successful. This was another female collared on February 26th at the base. And then by March 24th, she had made it to Greensboro. And then by April 25th, she was up in her new home range up in Virginia, 226 miles. So just a tremendous amount of area that they can cover. A third thing that makes coyotes really, really successful is just how they can adapt to mortality. So when there's not a lot of, there's lots of things that kill coyotes: vehicles, disease, they are hunted. So there's lots and lots of things. So when there's times of high mortalities, coyotes respond because there's decreased competition. They can actually increase their litter size. So they start having more pups. So this is one of those things that when you think about, especially out west, where you've heard they've had bounties out on coyotes and they've tried to poison coyotes, and they've been doing that for tons and tons of time. And the coyotes just keep responding because they keep on having, more pups. And then when we get to areas that there's low mortality and we're kind of saturated with coyotes, well, they respond because the resources aren't there. So their litter sizes are going to decrease. Those pup survival rates go down, and the yearlings that breed, those numbers go down. I don't have this on a slide, but they do have home ranges, but we also have coyotes that are kind of transient coyotes. And so you have one coyote that has a range here and another one has a home range here, and they kind of say, these are my areas. Well, you have these other transient coyotes that are just kind of walking around the periphery. And if one of those coyotes that has that home range gets killed, gets knocked out, guess what? Transient coyotes right there to fill that void, and then takes up all the roles, starts breeding. So if you are trying to eradicate one, it would be very difficult. We'll talk about that shortly. So coyote interactions in North Carolina. So this is the call. My job as district biologist is apparently to solve everybody's problems when it comes to wildlife. And so this is one that I get calls about, whether it's, folks that are concerned about their safety or their pet safety or livestock. But I think that really the impacts of coyotes in North Carolina is pretty minimal. I think they do fill an ecological role. Generally, they're not eating large prey. They're not eating a lot of deer. What they're eating mostly are going to be those small things, those rodents and small mice, things like that. So you kind of think of it as pest control. There's been plenty of studies that show when you remove these mesopredators, these mesocarnivores, which is just a medium-sized carnivore, in areas that have things like ducks, the duck nest success rate, skyrockets. So, these coyotes are kicking out things like foxes and skunks, and those other kind of smaller mesocarnivores, and as a result, some of our bird populations are increasing. Sometimes, the coyote populations might be additive, or I'm sorry, the predation might be additive. So if you have a small population of, let's say, deer, you live in an area that there's not a lot of deer. Well, if a coyote is going to eat those deer, sure, that can have an effect. But on the flip side, if there's a small population of deer, they're not as abundant. Coyotes are lazy, so they're likely not going to go after those things just because they're not as abundant. Red foxes, being a canine, is one of the things that could be adversely impacted. A lot of that's territory and just establishing a coyote's territory. So again, to talk about some of those human interactions and our different concerns, diseases, rabies always comes up as one of the things we're super concerned about, right? Human safety, property damage. And most of the time when we think property damage, we think livestock. But when we think about rabies, people get this vision of a coyote like Cujo looking thing with foaming at the mouth. But if we look at the breakdown of numbers that we see of rabies cases, coyote is not at the top. The top ones for carrying rabies in North Carolina is raccoon, skunk, and fox. Now, this data goes to 2015. If it was going on to 2023, the numbers will be a little bit different, but that same general trend is what we would see. Every mammal can get rabies. And so I don't think that it's a huge threat for, coyotes are going to be bringing all the rabies. In my career out here in the mountains, I've dealt with 2 white-tailed deer with rabies. And it's not like the movies. They're not foaming at the mouth and mad and going after people. I mean, most of the time when an animal gets rabies, they don't feel good. They feel sick. And so you're not going to see them. They're going to be hunkered away. But every mammal can get rabies. So, the urban coyote and human interactions, this is what we're seeing now. This urban suburban area that we live in, there are going to be more interactions with coyotes because they are so adaptable. But people have this built up fear of what a coyote is, and that's going to drive their perceptions. And no matter what you tell them, they've already got their mindset that coyotes are bad, and they will not, won't tolerate them. I've already heard some things earlier about people talking about, how many coyotes were around. And a lot of times that's overestimated. One coyote makes a whole lot of noise, and especially when it's on a mountain or a ridge around here, and that yipping and that howling just bounces around. That's why everybody says, oh, there's a pack of coyotes. Well, guess what? Coyotes don't really pack up. They're not wolves. So the only time they're really together is when they're breeding and right after mom has the pups. The rest of the time they're single, they're solitary. Most of the conflicts, and since you guys all live in Asheville, this should look really familiar for some reason, because you've heard this same story about bears, right? So the same thing that attract bears around attract coyotes. So having that pet food and bird seed and garbage out, it's just an easy food source. Coyotes, just like bears, are a generalist species. They're going to eat whatever is easiest. And of course, habituation is a problem. So places that coyotes are coming in, they are getting that food reward, getting that positive reinforcement, and there's no negative stimuli, they will become habituated. And we do see that, with every once in a while, with a coyote in a park or coming around folks. So they're going to adapt to living. That's what I just said. They're going to adapt to where they're not harassed. Attacks are rare. No unprovoked attacks in North Carolina that I know of. Now, rural coyote human interactions are a little bit different. Livestock, loss of livestock is a real concern. I do get calls about that every now and again, and generally, I have determined that what people think is coyotes has been just feral dogs or somebody's neighborhood dog who's gotten out. You can tell by the way they bite stuff, what they go after first. You can distinguish between a coyote, a feral dog, and a bear pretty easily. So, but there are coyotes that go after that livestock. But predation by wildlife, all wildlife, so bear, bobcat, coyote, wolves. That accounts for about 39% of all sheep and goat losses nationally. So it is, it can be an issue. This just kind of shows that sometimes coyotes are getting a bad rap. Okay, so here in North Carolina pre-2000, when a farmer's sheep got attacked, it was those darn dogs, those feral dogs came after it, right? And they were really upset about it. Well, then once people started seeing coyotes around and new coyotes around, well, now the blame shifted. It wasn't those feral dogs anymore. It's definitely coyotes. And it may be, both could be responsible, but it's not always the case. So for unconfined and unprotected livestock, they're going to be vulnerable. This can be changed just by husbandry practices. So electric fencing, or, putting up vulnerable livestock, newborn, things like that, get those in the barn at night. Eradication, I already mentioned this before, out west, it's been tried for, hundreds of years. In order to cause and maintain a population decline, you are going to have to remove 70% of your coyote population annually. It's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen for very long. As soon as you stop that removal of the coyotes, it'll only take a year or two for them to fill back in and you'll be right back at the same numbers that you were before. So it's not really possible or needed. We talked about, how far they can move and travel. We talked about, that how they react to having openings in the habitat and in their home range, where they'll just, with a decrease in competition, their litter sizes are going to increase. So it's really just not needed or even available. Some people have talked about bounties. That was a big thing out west. And history and science show it doesn't work. One, again, 70% of the population annually is going to have to be removed. But you're really only targeting less than 5% of the coyote population. You're only paying the people that are already catching coyotes. It's pretty hard to catch a coyote. We do have folks that trap, and they're pretty good at it. You start paying bounties, you're still just paying those folks. You're not paying new folks to do it. And there's a lot of fraud that has been documented. Some of those bounty programs would say, okay, we'll give you $50 per coyote, just bring in the tail. Well, you can go on eBay, get 100 coyote tails for $225. So you do the math, but that sounds like a pretty good gig just by going off of eBay. Super expensive, doesn't target the problem animals. And that's where, targeting the problem animals, that's what we would need to focus on when folks are having issues. We need to define those problems. Is it just that they're going after pet food and garbage and unsecured domestic animals? Or are we talking about areas that they're denning or hunting grounds? If they're going after a lot of rodents and you're keeping your grass tall, is that something that we need to address? So, this is basically our toolkit. So, we educate, we change our behaviors, we change our animal husbandry practices. For coyotes that have learned to be a bad coyote, a coyote that does feed on livestock and that's kind of its niche, well, things like trapping, hunting, depredation permits, can remove that particular coyote. The next coyote that moves in may not still have that same niche. It could live around livestock its whole life, but not ever go after it. Out west, you'll hear of folks that ranchers and things that they won't let people shoot coyotes on their property if they're not having any damage, because the coyotes that are there are eating the small rodents and the rabbits and all that. They're not going after the sheep. So they're going to keep their good coyotes that are maintaining a home range and prevent those ones that have a taste for lamb, off the property. So it's just matching the problem with the appropriate tool. Again, I won't really go too much into this. We already talked about this, but these non-lethal tools are really beneficial. you know, if you're worried about your dog going missing or your cat going missing, you know, keeping your dogs leashed, keeping those cats indoors. What's the stat? 3 million songbirds a year die by outdoor cats. That's crazy. So I'm not much of an outdoor cat person, but those husbandry practices, and if there are issues, that's what that little box is. It's our wildlife website that has Have a Problem, where you can go and there's find resources on how to deal with your coyote issue if you are having some kind of issue. So modifying habitat, and that's just, again, getting that garbage up, getting the pet food out, things that will be attracting to the coyote. All right, so that's it. What questions do you have?
As there are various strains or types of wolves, is that true of coyotes, or is the genetics of all coyotes the same?
Genetics is funny. Genetics is kind of like taxonomy, where you're either a lumper or a splitter, you know? And so with genetics, there are a lot of different genes in a coyote. So when I did my master's research and we were doing things, we found some coyotes that had, say, 10% red wolf in it and then 5% dog. And we had other ones that had no red wolf in it and 15% dog. So in that regard, there's kind of some strains, but they act all the same. You know, they act like a coyote. Yes, sir.
I have an elk question. Should I save it for the end?
Elk questions for later.
All right, let's do it.
Yes, sir. I don't know if it's on or not. I can hear you, but not through the mic, I don't believe.
Yep, red light on.
It's red. Okay, there it is. I think that's it.
There you go.
I attended a presentation last week that was held and they visited Yellowstone National Park where they introduced wolves. Is that an option? Because the wolves reduce the population of the coyotes.
So here's where my master's work comes in handy. I know this answer. So, you know, back in 1987, red wolves were reintroduced into North Carolina on the Albemarle Peninsula. At that time, it was thought there were no coyotes there. As we saw in the presentation, coyotes moved in, and one of the main issues that really hampered that red wolf program is that they did hybridize. So they weren't necessarily pushing them out. They would just hybridize with them. So they did try another reintroduction in the Smokies in the early 90s. It didn't work out. It was too hard to find the red wolves. They died from distemper. So after a couple of years, they just called it quits and said it just wouldn't be a successful thing out this way. So I don't think there's going to be any further reintroductions except for the Albemarle Peninsula that they're, you know, actively managing now with red wolves. That piques some more questions there.
I'm also interested in the population density, particularly in Buncombe and Madison County.
Population density is yes. It would be really difficult to get those densities. Basically, you know, we know that we have coyotes in all 100 counties. It would be really, really expensive to get those numbers, and I don't know what good it would do you. You know, if you knew like, oh, Buncombe County has, you know, 12 coyotes per square mile, we already know that we can't eradicate them. So what does it matter?
I get a lot of pictures on my trail cams of canine types. Is there any key way of telling the difference between the dogs and the coyotes and the foxes?
That collar.
Nighttime
Quite a
pictures.
bit. That dog collar is what I usually look for.
None of them have a collar.
So with The footprints, you can tell a little bit, still it's pretty hard because there's a lot of different types of domestic dogs, but a coyote footprint will usually be a bit longer and more slender than a domestic dog. Really, I would just say size and coloration. So when you're looking for something that's not quite 2 foot tall, if you ever have a question of something, you can send me a picture and I can tell you what I think. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Not so much a question as an observation, but you might like to sort of take it further. A few years ago, I was visiting on the West Coast, took a trail through a local nature preserve, and there was a coyote on the trail in front of me coming towards me. Healthy looking creature, but I didn't really trust it. Eventually, I joined up with somebody else and we went on together. Later, I saw some homeless encampments, and I figured the homeless people have been tossing crusts to the coyotes, and the coyotes are starting actually not just to be okay around people, but to actually approach them for food. And it occurred to me that great leap when humans, who knows how many, 10,000, 15,000 years ago, domesticated wolves and coyotes and canids generally, and started producing dogs, not difficult. Probably could happen multiple places within a year or two. Do you want to comment on that about, the origin of the dog compared with what we're seeing with coyote interactions?
No, I mean, that's a good point, and it's certainly something that can happen, and it's certainly something that you probably go on YouTube and find. People that feed animals intentionally, wildlife intentionally, and the wildlife comes up and eats it something right out of their hand. Even though that animal has kind of lost its fear of humans, doesn't negate the fact that it's still a wild animal, and it doesn't take a whole lot for that wild animal to come back and start acting like a wild animal. So I deal with that a lot here with bears and people that just want to feed bears and put it on YouTube. And as the man that has investigated, bear attacks, that just makes my blood boil. Same thing with coyotes. So it can happen for it to be like something like a dog. I mean, that would still take thousands of years, and everybody would have to be on board. And I just don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, certainly a possibility. It's been done once, right? So we'll get her, and then we'll come to you, sir.
I noticed in your study of food that coyotes eat that you included vegetables.
I did.
Okay, well, so I'm wondering if it could have been a coyote who pulled 2 of my prized butternut squash off the vine and left them in the yard with very deep holes in them.
Apparently your butternut squash are not delicious to a coyote. You should work harder next year. No. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And coyotes are so varied that you'll have some that will be curious and investigate that, where the next coyote that comes through wants nothing to do with vegetables.
I figured they didn't want them because they left them there.
Sometimes you will see them, just like especially juveniles, you will see them being playful, and they'll just mess with stuff, just like our bears mess with stuff. Occasionally, coyotes will do the same. Yes, sir. You had a question?
Yeah, I have a collection here. How do they go about hunting deer is one, and
Deer?
yeah,
Oh, the coyotes.
yeah. And do you have any recordings of vocalizations? And I heard a theory some years ago that coyote actually were a cross between a wolf and something else.
Sure. So, generally, I mean, with any predator, if they're going after some kind of large prey, they're going to go after the weak, the sick, the old. So no different with deer. You do get fawn predation happens a lot, especially when you have places that have a lot of deer around. The deer in my study and at the Fort Bragg study, one of the bad things about analyzing diet by scat is that we can't differentiate what was predated and what was scavenged. So things that, roadkill, it certainly could be roadkill that they were eating on. But they can go after adult animals. There's plenty of videos to document that. So it's just, but generally they're going to go after the sick, the weak, and the old. The third question was about the fact is a coyote a hybrid? Again, that just gets into that murky waters of genetic stuff. There, to this day, is still a debate about red wolves, and if red wolves were a mix between coyotes and regular wolves. With coyotes, like I said in that gentleman's question earlier, there's just a whole lot of admixture there. So it's going to be really tough to kind of tease that out. I'm not sure if that'll ever get solved. And I forgot the second question. I don't have any recordings of vocalizations, but that's a real easy YouTube search. You just Google that. It's a lot higher pitched than most people think. I believe Mayo was going to give us, she was going to practice her coyote vocalizations later. No. But it's just high, it's kind of high pitched yipping and yelping. And then sometimes it will kind of go into that howl. So I'll grab her and I'll come to you. Yes, ma'am.
I love hosta, and the deer in my area like the hosta too. And I've heard it called deer candy. So I go to Boo Barnes or Ace and I buy urine. Is that coyote urine or wolf urine? And are there coyote farms where they collect the urine? Because there's a lot of bottles of urine out there that I've seen on store shelves. So I'm just curious.
I think I'm going to supplement my income. And so I know that with the stuff that they sell as coyote urine are generally from trapped coyotes. They still have a full bladder and they'll extract it that way. I don't know if there's coyote farms. I imagine a lot of that stuff is pretty cut down and reduced. That, in my opinion and experience, that stuff has limited effect anyway. You're better off by buying deer resistant plants, putting up fencing. There is stuff called deer off. That's like a powder that you spray is or put out is pretty expensive, and it's not rain resistant. The fact that we live in a rainforest and we have foggy mornings every morning doesn't help. So you kind of have to go with that problem with multiple prong approach. So deer resistant fencing, even motion activated sprinklers, things of that nature could be helpful. Yeah, Irish Spring. People say, hang human hair out there. I've heard it all, and I've seen very little work except for those things I just mentioned. That's probably just stop buying the plants that they like. It's probably a better course of action. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I was surprised to hear that they're not pack animals, because I've heard times where we used to live, there was some cattle. I know they had calves, and it's the sound, like a frenzy, and it certainly sounds like more than one. It just
so they don't travel in
one?
packs, and they generally don't hunt like a wolf does in a pack. However, if there is something down, you're going to have some competition. If it is, say, March until August, you're going to have mom with her pups still. So you are going to have multiples at that point, right? You're going to have mom and then up to 9 or 10 pups. So I guess I don't consider that a pack. That's more of a family unit, before dispersal. And then if you're just hearing stuff, again, if you're just hearing things, especially in the fall, in the winter, the sound just bounces and it just makes them sound like there's a billion of them out there. I'd love an elk question. I'm tired of coyotes. Let's talk elk.
Thank you. So, in Cataloochee, if you're heading towards the Woody cabin in one of the last roads, it's like something big fork trail or something. It looks like there's these exclosures. But maybe they're enclosures, they don't look like it. Do
So
you,
those are just, those are exclosures. So I don't work for the Park Service. But I know some stuff about them, so I'll tell you. So those are just vegetation exclosures, basically looking at, if the elk are having any kind of impact on the vegetation that's there. And they also have a lot of hogs there. And again, it's the same thing, just seeing if the hogs are really impacting, they can't get into those exclosures. So it's just a way of monitoring vegetation use.
thank you.
Yes.
Now that you've gotten off coyotes, I wonder if you could address armadillos.
Armadillos. So thank you, climate change, for armadillos. For years and years, we told folks that, we would have some wayward armadillos. They're not native to North Carolina, but due to our cold winters here in the mountains, they couldn't survive and we wouldn't have breeding populations. Well, our cold winters here in the mountains aren't so cold anymore. And so as a result, we are getting some breeding populations. Armadillos can be pretty destructive, although they are a carrier of leprosy. The likelihood that you'll get that from them is pretty low. They can, and like I said, they can do a lot of damage. So we don't want them here, but they're here. They're tough to get rid of. The furthest one that I've seen, north was Leicester. As we go down to the South Carolina, Georgia line, I see a lot more records in that area of armadillos.
I guess the good news is they have problems crossing streets.
They do. Well, they have two defense mechanisms. One's to jump straight up in the air, which is right where bumpers are. And the other defense mechanism is to lay down flat, which doesn't work either for crossing a road. So.
Any other questions?
There's a bunch in chat and I've been asked if they were going to be gotten to.
No, you should have showed up in person. Just teasing Zoom, folks. We'll get to you here. Let me figure out how to do it.
Okay, let's see. I'm not seeing them.
I think Mayo can read them, or I can.
Oh, there they are. Sorry,
That's, the Lord asks questions.
Okay, and mountain environment, McDowell County, I sometimes hear a late night vociferous yowling, very frenzied, and then silence. Don't think it's hunters with their dogs, assumed it was a pack hunting. Could it be coyotes?
I mean, it could be, but it's not going to be a pack. It may be a group during that one period where, mom has her pups. And there may be some competition every now and again. Breeding season is January through March, but it's not going to be a pack of coyotes.
And have you done any mobility studies with collaring like they do with bears in the mountains?
We've not done any coyote mobility studies or looked at coyote movements here in the mountains. The only GPS collar stuff that we've done or anybody's done is really that Fort Bragg work, and that was really centered around deer predation and things of that nature. But I mean, from that, we did see those really far dispersal patterns, and it would be safe to say that coyotes here in the mountains have that same ability to disperse great distances. It all relates to resources. Where's the food? Where's the ladies? Where's the space? That's what's going to move those coyotes.
This next one's good. They want to know if a bright neon flashing collar on a small dog would deter a coyote.
I think initially it would. Again, it really depends on your coyote, but I haven't seen it, and my research didn't dig any up.
I think that's it from the chat world. Just to let you know, we did have 36 people on Zoom tonight, in addition to this nice room full that we've got here. So let's give a big hand to Justin for an excellent.
Something else just came through online too.
What did?
Can you-
Something else just came through on chat online. I can read it. The question says, if a female wolf gives birth to 8 to 9 pups, how many of those pups will live to adulthood?
It's highly variable. So, I mean, if all the conditions are good, you could see, 70-80% of those would survive. So a good survival rate is probably about 80%. So if there was enough food, they weren't being persecuted, nothing was preying upon them, easily 80%.
Just didn't mention that he's also on the board of Appalachian Wildlife Rescue, which takes in injured animals. And you may be interested to know that the speaker fee for tonight will be donated to them on his behalf. The recording of this program will be up on our website probably in 3 to 4 days when we get the recording from Ollie. And if you know anybody who'd be interested in this topic that wasn't here, let them know about that. And with that, we'll say good evening.